Hey guys, it's me Lucin. Thank you for stopping by, and today's video is going to be a compilation of scary stories. If you guys enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and consider checking out my other videos if you have the time. But without further ado, let's get right into these scary stories. Ellen had just fallen asleep when she heard a strange voice. Ellen. It whispered, I'm coming up the stairs. I am on the step. Now, I am on the second step. Ellen got scared and called her parents, but they didn't hear her, and they come. The voice whispered, Ellen, I'm on the top step. Now I'm in the hall. Now, I'm outside your room. Then it whispered, I'm standing right next to your bed. And then, I've got you. Ellen screamed and the voice stopped. Her father rushed into the room and turned on the light. Somebody is in here, Ellen said. They looked and looked, but nobody was there. This story comes from a good friend of mine who used to be in the Boy Scouts. To my knowledge, the events that take place in this story are 100% true. I will also leave a link in the description if you want to check out the article about this. This took place around 2015 when I was active in the Boy Scouts. Every summer, my troop would always travel to a camp known as Hidden Valley, located in rural Pennsylvania. It was a pretty nice camp. It had nice facilities, a pool, a river that went right through the camp, as well as many merit badge options for scouts to take. Despite this, the camp had a bad past as in 2007, a scout was killed in a terrible accident. This always created an eerie feeling for my troop as our campsite was around 100 feet his memorial. Anyway, that year I took 4 merit badges including wilderness survival. The final requirement for the merit badge involved building a temporary shelter and sleeping in it for one night. This was no problem for me. 3 other kids in my troops were also taking the merit badge test, so we all decided to make one big shelter. We strung up a rope between 2 large trees and then hung a tarp from a portable garage over it to create a homemade tent. Eventually, nightfall came, and we settled down in our sleeping bags. I was at the end of the tent, which meant I was positioned so I could see straight out of the large opening of the tent. The other scouts and I told stories for a little while, but after that, we fell asleep. Later in the night, I awoke to the sounds of sticks and small rocks being thrown at the tarp. At first, I thought they were acorns, but they came so fast. One hit the tarp at least every 2 or 3 seconds. I tried to play it off, but then I heard something that truly terrified me. A giggle came from outside the shelter. At this point, I turned to look out through the opening, and that is when I saw them. There were figures peering out from behind the trees. Maybe like 4 or 5 of them. They seemed to be aware that I was awake as they just stood there, staring directly at me. It almost felt like they were staring deep into my soul. Frozen in fear, I watched them continue to pop their heads out from behind the trees. I couldn't even move. It was like my body had locked up in terror, but eventually, I mustered up enough courage to roll over and tap the scout beside me on the shoulder. I kept trying to wake him up, but he wouldn't even move. It felt as if I was in some horrific nightmare that I couldn't even escape. After many attempts to wake him up, without trying to alert the shadow figures, I gave up. I rolled back over and tried to block out this horrific event, but I realized that the figures were no longer there. I looked and squinted my eyes, but I could not see them. Not only that, but the stone throwing had also come to a stop. Still being paranoid, I laid there awake for at least another hour, staring out into the deep darkness. I must have fallen asleep at some point in time because I later woke up to the birds chirping and the sun rays shining in my eyes. I played it off as though nothing happened the night before. To be completely honest, I thought it was just some sort of twisted nightmare. That was until, during breakfast, I heard my friend Josh say,
Did you guys hear all those stones getting thrown at the cabins last night?
Most of the troops agreed that something had occurred. I'm unsure of what happened on that ill-fated night, but I do know that I will never forget that experience, and I definitely won't be going back to those woods. Number 2. I'm a tall, yet extremely skinny guy, and I'm 21 years old. I was 20 years old at the time, and it was the week before the presidential election in the United States. I felt a lot of anxiety about the election, as I live in Manhattan, and there was a lot of crazy people in that city who act as if the entire world is going to end over one simple election. So feeling exhausted from both of that and my university, I decided to visit my friends in Moscow. I'm half Russian and have an apartment in the city center of Moscow. I have never been in Russia while it snowed, and luckily, during this time it was snowing. The city looked beautiful, and the vibe I had from the city was perfect. I felt so calm, safe, and the whole world around me just seemed so quiet. Unfortunately, I had severe jet lag and fell asleep around 5 p.m. Moscow time that day. My friend went home to get ready for her classes the next day, and I woke up around 3 a.m. I could not fall back asleep, so I decided to go outside and take a walk around my area while it calmly snowed. I walked around the dead, empty city in my district and took in all of the most beautiful architecture and snow falling down heavily. I don't remember for how long I was walking, but I crossed a bridge and entered deeply into a neighborhood I was not familiar with. I thought it would be okay, as I was in my district and sort of remembered the way back home. I eventually came up to this ginormous entrance of a block unit with a beautiful gate on it. The gate was opened, so I decided to step inside. It looked like a small little compound or something similar to it. If anyone is from Russia, they probably know what I am talking about. Everything was dead quiet, and the trees were canopied in the square complex. To the right was an extremely tall building with a ginormous door. I peeked inside and saw a lightly dimmed lobby with a blinking fluorescent light. I held on the door, and to my surprise it was unlocked. I entered into the massive building and looked around. I saw many stairs wrapping around in a square leading up, a small typical Russian elevator, and to the right of the stairwell stairs that led down, the door at the bottom of the stairs was open. I absolutely do not know what came over me, as I am not the one to adventure alone, but as I stated earlier, everything felt so beautiful. The quiet vibe of the snow-covered Russia had me feeling so peaceful, and I decided to just tiptoe on down into the basement to take a closer look. I walked into the room with the open door and threw on my flashlight on my phone. I saw an extremely long tunnel, and I could not see the end of it. I felt threatened by it for some reason, and I got extremely uncomfortable. I decided it was best for me to leave. When I turned around, the only light that was entering the tunnel was from outside of the doorway. I then saw standing in the doorway a black silhouette. I quickly understood it was the outline of a person who was at least 5 inches taller than me. So I would say he was about 6'5". He was massive, and my stomach jumped so hard with my heart beginning to beat super quickly. He started to speak to me in Russian, but as my Russian isn't fluent, I did not understand everything he said. "I'm sorry, I don't speak Russian," I said to him in Russian.
You speak English?
He said in English to me. I told him I did, and he asked me if I knew where I was. No, I told him, as my mind started to fill up with a lot of different scenarios, one of which, with me having to run down this tunnel and getting lost to avoid him if he chased me.
These tunnels used to be used for Red Army soldiers to move from one place to another during the war.
He explained to me.
This whole building used to be a bunker for Red Army soldiers.
I said, to show some interest, and began to move towards the left while facing him, in attempts to get him to move out of the doorway.
This whole place is now apartments. I have one on top of the floor. You should come see it.
He said to me. It's quite late, and I think I should be going, I said. However, he grabbed my small wrist with a lot of strength, and led me towards the stairs to go to the main floor of the lobby.
I have you love.
He called the small elevator, and if any of you have ever been to Russia, you'll know exactly what type of elevator it is, the type that can barely fit 2 people. He began telling me about how he just got back from Chicago, and that his husband loves Chicago as well. This started to have me panicking, as I thought to myself that there would be another man up there to where he was bringing me, and I would have 2 men overpower me. Once we go to his room, I looked at this massive studio apartment he had. He only had candles to light the room, with a lot of tapestries dividing it up, with both the candle and moonlight shining through it. Create a super eerie vibe. I looked out of his window as he instructed me, and I have to admit, the view was amazing. I got a panoramic view of the city and of the building. I then started scoping around, looking for an opportunity to get out of there. "Where is your husband?" I asked. He looked at me and laughed.
He's dead.
He then picked me up, and I asked him what he was doing. He brought me into another room and began to touch me inappropriately. He ran his hand down my back and took my phone from my back pocket. I did not realize he did this, as I was just in horror as this man licked me and said explicit things in Russian. I tried to pull away, but it made him squeeze and corner me even harder. After about 10 minutes of this, he told me to wait a moment. He went to his bathroom, and in this moment, I immediately sprinted over to the door. There were no lights, so I went to pull out my phone for the flashlight, only to my horror, the phone was missing from my back pocket. I almost nearly had a heart attack, as I realized I would have to go back into the bedroom to get my phone. I darted back into the room and saw my phone laying on the couch he had next to his bed. I grabbed it and ran for the door. I unlocked 2 locks on one door, and when I opened the one, there was an outer door. I managed to get it open. As I ran out, the adrenaline was so high in me. I ignored the elevator and went straight for the stairs. I ran around in circles down for what seemed like forever, until I finally reached the bottom. I practically leaped down a few steps to go out of the lobby to the main door I had entered from. It wouldn't open, as I pushed as hard as I could on it. I then began to start sobbing to myself and cursing. The thought of me having to go back into that tunnel to hide again from him came over me, and I almost began to accept that as a reality at this point. I quickly tried to pull myself together and noticed the typical button you should press to disable the magnet that holds the door locked. I pressed it, heard the monotone beep that follows, and fell out of the door and into the snow. I never understood why characters could not pull themselves together when running in horror movies, always falling on themselves. But in that moment, I did the same, and I sort of understand it now. I treaded through the thigh-high snow into the main road by exiting the complex. I sprinted, ignoring my lungs screaming for air down the main road. Only slowing down once, I reached a bridge that led me to my street. Once I got inside, I sat in my bed for 2 hours, nearly shaking before I told anyone about it.
This is not a test. The state of California is under emergency. Please stay in your homes. Do not leave. If you leave, you will be under heavy surveillance. Something has broken into our dimension. Stay inside for your own personal safety. Again, this is not a test. If you wish to leave your home, you may be facing dangers beyond our help.
I'm a 24-year-old soldier, and after what happened to me, I have had an uncontrollable fear of sirens. Every Saturday night at camp, I can hear screams that only I can hear. I wake up my friends sometimes just to see their reactions and maybe figure out a solution about it. Maybe even check it out or something like that. But they never heard a thing. Every time I hear those screams, they're either a man's, a woman's, or a child's scream. But there's something peculiar about them. It has this quite noticeable static sound every time someone screams. Or should I say, whenever a scream plays. It sounds like it's coming out of a siren, and it wakes me up every night. I've learned to ignore it, and I thought that it's probably just me imagining things, since I didn't like sirens that much as a kid either. Too loud to be enjoyable. It wakes me up every night, and it sounds very realistic. So I thought I should ask the headmaster if our sirens accidentally play those weird sounds at night. Next morning, I talked to him about it, and he said that it may have been an error. But even if it was, the sirens were turned off at night. Only the alarm ones were on. I tried to get him to look deeper into this thing, because I doubt it was just an error, and I was sure it was coming from a siren. But he said he thinks I'm talking nonsense, and sent me to do some exercises with the other soldiers. He might have been right. I maybe was just a bit paranoid after all, so I thought. But this night, the sounds weren't that loud. It sounded as if it was playing from somewhere inside the forest. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight, a shotgun, and sneaked out of camp to go into the forests and investigate. Now, I know I may sound like a dumbass for doing this, like going out of camp to go check it out, but those screams were making my sanity fall apart. I kept walking and walking. Nothing was found, but I could hear the sounds getting louder. I'm sure I was approaching it. I ended up in a straight dirt road, and then I saw something. It was too dark to see, but I could see something really freaky in the dark. It was in the middle of the road, so I pointed my flashlight at it, and there it was. A slim monster that was about as tall as a tree, having long arms that could reach its toes, and for a head of 2 sirens connected into one tube. It looked very skinny, as if it was only bones, but you could clearly see some flesh on it, and it had metallic wires going through its body. I was terrified, but without any second thoughts, I immediately held my gun and shot it. It didn't die. The bullet marks were clear and I could see some blood running down, but instead of showing signs of pain, it started walking towards me. Without any second thoughts, I ran the opposite direction from where I was facing. The sirens started playing sounds to scare me and kept playing it over and over. The static sound always gave me a fucked up feeling in my stomach, but from close up, it was more terrifying. It then started to play some other weird sounds coming from its sirens, such as tornado warnings, Amber Alert announcements, and generally announcers speaking about scary things, such as murders, criminal escapes, and other messed up stuff. I could run really fast, but even though it was walking, it wasn't that far away from me. Let's say I was far enough from it to not catch me. I grabbed my gun again, stopped, and shot a siren. The sounds it was playing were glitching out. I managed to outrun it, but it started approaching me pretty quickly. I was far enough, but I could still see it in the dark. I was running for about half an hour, felt more like an eternity. Our distance didn't even change by a centimeter. It felt like I was running on an infinite road. Luckily, I could see a car, thought someone was there, whoever it was. I needed them to get me away from that thing, but to my disappointment, it was locked. Big mistake stopping. The monster was now a bit closer, and the road got really muddy, so it slowed me down. I got out of the road and got inside the forest. It didn't come in. I could see it facing at me, but it stopped moving. I saw my camp. I was relieved, but still scared to stop and relax. I asked the guards to let me in, and since they knew me, they obviously opened the door. They asked me what the hell I was doing outside this late, and how did I get out. I apologized and asked them to keep it a secret, but I later explained to them what I saw and how I left. They probably felt sorry for me and thought that I was being paranoid, so they told me to go get some rest. I swore to them I didn't lie for what I had seen. They still didn't believe me. I shrugged it off and went back to my bed. That night I was so terrified. It was the most scary experience I ever had. Around 5-6 a.m., I woke up to sounds of screams and a subtle smell of smoke. I came outside to see what woke me up. Everything was on fire. Towers were torn apart, and I could see piles of dead bodies. The thing that caught my eye, though, was what I had seen some hours ago. That tall, skinny siren head monster. It was responsible for everything. Soldiers begged me to help them, but I could not do anything about it. They were literally torn in half. The monster saw me and reached out to grab me. It missed. The whole camp was on fire. I even wondered if I was in hell. I ran and ran. It chased me, but I never stopped running. After running for so long, I came to the end of a cliff, and now that there was light, I saw the monster more clearly now, and it was more terrifying than before. It stopped walking.
Do you like heights, Mark?
How could this monster know my name? This had to be a never-ending nightmare, but it was reality.
Come to me.
I begged the monster not to kill me. I cried and asked it to leave me alone. To my surprise, it left. Not sure if it regrets its decision or just wanted to get revenge later. As I watched it turn around and disappear into the woods, I felt relieved that I escaped out of this situation. I went back to camp just to see all those dead bodies and broken buildings. But I had to call someone or I wasn't leaving this place. I'm always carrying my cell phone. So I called 911 and told them to come to the camp's address. When they arrived, they told me to explain what happened and how I survived. I described everything by detail, but they thought I was joking and told me to act serious. I told them I was, and they finally took it seriously. Sort of. They said they'd investigate this. I packed my stuff and they brought me back to my city. I went back home and was happy to see my wife and kids. They were surprised I came so early. I was supposed to come home 5 months later. I explained to my wife what had happened, and she just wouldn't believe me. She said I probably needed some rest and got all this shit out of my crazy imagination. However, all this makes me curious. Am I living in a nightmare? Was I actually paranoid? Whatever it was, it's done for now. I pushed the curtains aside and opened the window to get some fresh air. I looked outside. It felt good to be home. But what I saw in the distance made me feel shocked. The monster was on top of a building really far away. I tried to ignore it and went to get some sleep. But as I closed my eyes, I could hear that all too familiar sound.
Citizens, this is not a test. If you leave your home, you will be under heavy surveillance, and you do risk possible death or injury to your family. If you wish to live, stay in your homes and do not open the doors. Lock every window and nook and cranny inside of your home. And if you leave,
We will find you.
children dying, people screaming, women crying. Whoa, 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 warning. Something has broken into our dimension. If you are listening, it is already too late. The end is near. Please help me. The time has come. You all will be enlightened. Warning, this is not a test.
This story actually comes from a very good friend of mine. The events that take place are 100% accurate, and to this day, it still terrifies him. This took place back when I was just 16 years old. It was the summer between 10th and 11th grade, and a couple of my friends had convinced me to do the summer drama production. Our rehearsals took place at the local middle school, which was built in 1958, and for the most part, it was a very fun experience, all except for one incident. During rehearsals, there was a lot of downtimes. If there was a scene being rehearsed that you were not a part of, you could just explore the school. Being teenage boys, my friends and I managed to gain access to the old basement in order to look around. When we first went down the old steps, we noticed a large room with what appeared to be boilers or some kind of AC heating unit. We looked around but quickly got bored. That was until we noticed a door at the base of the stairs that we somehow missed. My friends David, Josh, Cole, and I all approached the door and opened it. It was a very long room, probably 15 by at least 50 feet, and the floor was dirt. Dust filled the air, which made it very hard to see. It was probably filled with asbestos or lead paint chip particles, but hey, we were so young we didn't care. Stacks of desks and chairs lined the walls, going the whole way back to the room.
I've been down here before, but I've never seen this room,
said Josh.
Yeah, I guess this is where they all store all the extra desks and stuff.
Colin replied. We continued walking back to the room and we realized the floor actually sloped up towards the ceiling gradually. By the time we were nearing the end of the room, we noticed that there were large amounts of pipes at the end, and the dirt sloped up to the pipes, which made the ceiling only about 3 feet high. At this point, we figured that we were under the foundation due to the pipes and dirt, but we continued anyway. I decided to take the front and start crawling through the mess of metal and PVC. Over the first, under the second, trying not to hit my head, I put in my phone flashlight into the mess of pipes to see where I was going. That's when I saw it. It was like a picturesque horror movie scene. On the other side of the maze of pipes was a 6x6 room, cut out in the now probably 4-foot high dirt. In the center of the room was a lone chair. I immediately froze, and not only fear, but confusion. There wasn't anything necessarily scary about the chair, but it gave you this feeling, this vibe that lurks in the back of your mind, almost like there was someone watching you, but there wasn't. I quickly yelled for my friends. They all came crawling through the pipes until they saw it. We made the decision right then and there to get the hell out of that basement. We didn't stop to take pictures or go further to investigate. Each and every one of us could feel the sense of dread that came off from the chair. I ran as fast as I could with not a care in the world for the people around me. After getting back upstairs, we sat and pondered what had just occurred. We all saw the chair. We all felt the feeling. But we couldn't even begin to talk about it. After a while, we eventually calmed down, which was when Josh told us something that made this so scary.
If we couldn't even crawl through the pipes, how did someone get a chair back there and make an entire room?
This all happened about 2 years ago now. Life has changed and most of the kids in the basement with me have fallen out. All of us remember the chair, but none of us try to talk about it. Why that is, I'm unsure. But something that I am sure of is that since that day, the chair has never left my mind. I've always been drawn to it. For some reason, I feel like I need to go back there. Whatever that is, it might just be my curiosity, or the chair is drawing me in as if it's some entity. I do not know. Someday I will go back, but today is not the day. And until then, I'll continue to see that chair in my nightmares. Just to start off with some backstory, my group of friends had started making a nasty habit of joking about the Wendigo. My friend Stacy and I didn't for a while, just due to the fact that we believed in the supernatural. But after a few months, it grew on us, and not knowing that the Wendigo can actually be triggered by such things, we joined in. The biggest mistake ever. I had just moved into the country, and we enjoyed making trips into town to have a few drinks, which is about a 30-minute walk from my place to town. At night, the first 10 minutes after leaving the bridge that leads out of town is pitch darkness, with no streetlights. After that, streetlights are very sparsely places, which can cause for a very creepy walk back without anything happening. So, with all that in place, let's continue. Stacy and I begin our night, walking into town, have some beers and have some fun. Shortly into the night, something slightly strange happens. We receive a phone call from her little sister at home crying and scared because she saw someone sitting on my friend Stacy's bed. She calms her sister down and asks her cousin to check her room for her sister at home. Everything is fine. No one is in the room. Also, ghosts and weird things happening at her house were very common, so a sighting like this was strangely regular. We continue our night. Into the night, we meet a guy who seems pretty cool. He's riding a bike and tells us he's pretty drunk or something. We decide to hang with him for a bit, wanting to meet people in town. A ways into our hangout, we are sitting on a park bench, and the guy is laying on the ground in front of us. Suddenly, my friend stands up and says it's time for us to go. I shrug and agree, and we get going. After getting away from him, she tells me how the guy bit her ankle. The day after, she had teeth bruises on her ankle. Kind of flustered the guy would do that, we continue our walk out of town. Finally, we pass the bridge, which is our last source of light for the next 10 minutes. We turn on our phone flashlights, and we turn on some music trying to ease the spooky feeling of being in pitch darkness in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, we hear a voice behind us. We both jump. It's the same guy on his bike. He asks us if he can follow us until we reach the fork in the road. We need to go left, and he needs to go right. Still slightly creeped out, but we are almost at the streetlights and the fork in the road. We agree. Regardless, he had to go that way, and so did we. After a bit of walking, we finally reached the fork in the road and the first streetlight. We sigh with relief, hoping he would leave, but he turns down our way instead of going the way he needs to go. Now, at this point, we are thoroughly creeped out. We try to ignore it and keep walking, holding our breaths, wanting to reach the next streetlight, which is some ways away. Finally, after what felt like forever, we reached the next streetlight, which is also for some reason a small graveyard. Once we reached the streetlight, the guy stops dead in his tracks and doesn't move any further past it. As we turn around, guy looks like he has suddenly passed out on his bike, his head down and shoulders slumped. I was about to say something to him, but my friend stopped me and said we really needed to leave him. I agreed, not wanting to be around him much longer either. After a few seconds, I take a peek over my shoulder. He's gone. Vanished. The worst part is, even if he had turned around and started pedaling as fast as he could, we still would have been able to see him some ways down the road. I panicked, but also slightly relieved he wasn't there anymore. We continue walking, trying to pretend we aren't creeped out. Walking quickly from streetlight to streetlight. Finally, we reach my driveway. My driveway is a long road of darkness. We hadn't put any lights in yet to try and brighten it. We begin to walk slowly, holding our breath. Some weird feeling of dread came over me the closer and closer we got to my house, and the further into the driveway we entered. I don't know what came over us, but the sudden feeling of, you need to run, and you need to run fast, came over us at the same time. We took off bolting at the exact same time without having to say a word to each other. We got to my front door. I unlocked it quicker than I have ever before. We get inside. I slammed the door closed and locked it, and dropping to the ground in fear. We both sat there holding our breaths, scared to even breathe. Fast forward a couple of weeks. My friend Stacy and I had forgotten about what happened. Suddenly, it came up in a conversation, and we tried to find the sound we heard. Nothing worked. We looked up every possible animal, even animals that weren't likely. We spent an hour on this, until we decided to look up the sound of a wendigo. It was the only sound that fit perfectly. We don't joke or talk about it now. I won't. I hate to. That man we saw that night, we may never know who or what he was. But as far as I know, I'm happy keeping that a mystery for the rest of my life. The singular knock I heard was followed up by what sounded like scratching at the door. The scratching sounded more like it came from a wild animal, and not some creep who stealthily knocked on people's doors for cruel laughs. I jumped so high that I had to stop myself from falling. My heart began to race as I felt the same fear I had when I thought back to the first incident. Snapping out of it and moving quickly, I stood up and frantically searched for some sort of weapon. I wasn't taking any chances. This had become too real now. I was at the corner now, preparing myself for the worst. Fighting my racing heart and shaking hands, I turned to the corner, not knowing what I would be met with. The first thing I saw was my dog Sam. I felt a little relieved at the sight of him, thinking he was a source of scratching, except he was moving. The scratching was still persistent. Sam, however, was staring straight towards the scratching. His hairs were rising as he began to growl at the door. That was the last straw for me. I dropped the knife and ran for my home phone that sat on the end of my table. My hands were shaking profusely as I held the phone and dialed 911, shakingly holding the phone up to my ear. I turned around facing the kitchen. I immediately regret that decision. I dropped the phone I was holding. I could hear the muffled questions of the operator. For the first time, I felt genuine fear for my life. He was tall, my God. So tall I couldn't see his face. Through the doorway into the kitchen, he was also quite slender. But it wasn't his build that was intimidating. He wore a dark suit with a red and white striped tie, with a clean white undershirt. The worst feature, however, was his hands. Long, bony, and half-clenched fingers. The nails, too, were long and almost sharp. The color of his hands were a silky white. I stared in horror. Sam was nowhere to be seen, but I didn't care at that time. My entire focus was on this demon in my own home. Too scared to move, I stood motionless, if shaking violently could be considered so. I began ever so slightly moving towards the door. Then he moved. A single long stride, then another. Once more. It only took him 3 to reach the doorway. That's when he ducked, and I saw his cursed face. He was smiling, a crooked and broken grin that stretched along his entire face. His face was the same silky pale his hands were. The eyes were shattered and piercing, staring directly into my soul. One last attempt at safety. I unlocked it, but got no further. I felt a cold and skinny hand rest on my shoulder. I froze. The other hand slowly moved into my view, covering my mouth with a deathly cold grip. I gasped and woke up. Sitting straight up, my entire body was covered in a cold sweat. I was breathing, heavily, still shaking. I should have felt relieved that it was all over, that it was all a dream. And yet, there was still that tension in the air. The same fear that one felt so real began to return, paralyzing me, and from the corner of my eye, I could see the same shattered eyes that had once stared me down. He was standing in the doorway, smiling. Then he opened his crooked mouth and in a raspy voice said,
You should have went back to sleep.
Hello friends, it's me Lucid. Thank you so much for watching my video if you made it this far. Also, I wanted to thank you guys for 94 subscribers. Oh my goodness. It makes me oh so happy to see that you guys love my content and you watch it. But I have a 100 sub special coming very soon, and thank you again for being such a loyal and kind fan to me. But have a good one. See you tomorrow.